A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Issues, I guess you could say we're going to be into the deep end today on a topic that's often uncomfortable to talk about. We rarely love talking about death and dying because we think it's going to be a morbid, a conversation about grief and tragedy. But I think we're in for a refreshing conversation, not afraid to talk about the hard things, but filled with hope, encouragement, and even a sense of empowerment. In our Christian tradition, the writer to the Hebrews is fairly blunt about our prospects, saying we are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment. Some philosophers are straight to the point too. Being alive, just pinch yourself for a moment, being alive is itself a terminal condition. So today we're looking to make sense of death and dying. What does science conclude? And how does that contrast with our Christian belief based on a biblical foundation? Well, our special guest today is Steve Morrison. He is a transformational life coach, a chaplain, and a specialist counsellor. And he's presided over more than 1,300 funerals. His expertise is in a field called Thanatology. Now, you might never have heard of that. What is a Thanatologist? An expert in the science of death and the practices associated with it. I might make a special welcome to an old friend, an old colleague, and Steve Morrison. A special welcome along to 2020.
Oh, thank you, Neil. It's a real pleasure to be here. And yes, we go back many decades. And so what a wonderful joy today to connect, to discuss, as you say, a topic that normally many would run the other way. And I do invite, as you have, people just to lean in as we open up this really essential part of life. The reality of life is there will be death. You know, there's a first day and there will be a last day. And I think unpacking that in this next, hour together will be not only informative, but I hope fun, and we'll tell lots of stories and open things up. So, again, thanks for having me.
Hey, you're the guy we like to have around when the going gets tough, because there are times of crisis, there are times of grief. We lose a loved one, someone that we rely upon. There's emotional distress in all of that. I guess you've probably immersed yourself in more family situations, having presided over something like 1,300 funerals, than most people ever even imagine. You've seen it all, haven't you?
Yeah, it's quite amazing. I say one of the things about grief first up is that it illuminates or highlights who people are. And so, for me, for example, I'll get a phone call from the funeral home. Can you go and see, Danny? And I don't know the family of Danny and the family and the deceased, and I'll walk in there and you have no idea what you're walking into. And one of the things I find straight away is those who are good at hospitality are more hospitable. Those who are talkative are probably more talkative, and those who are quiet are probably more quiet, and those who are angry are probably more angry. It's really interesting how that part of people is so enhanced and when we come into grief. But walking into a family when they've just lost a loved one is really, it's a privileged space. Like, it's such a privileged space to be able to bring hope. I hope I can bring hope, even when there's perhaps not faith involved, and I'm sure we'll open that up as we go along. But that's a really precious space. I walk in, there could be one. Just last week I walked in, there was one lady, she had lost her husband of nearly 60 years, family still hadn't arrived, and there's just me and her talking about, this amazing husband of hers who died in his late 80s. And it was such a privilege. It was such a beautiful time. And then other times I'll walk into a family and there'll be 20 people and it'll be loud and chaotic and crazy. And would you like a cup of tea? And then they can't remember what you asked for, and it becomes crazy. Everything in between. And then, of course, depending on that one, there was a late 80s, but I also walk into someone who's just lost a baby, or there's been a stillborn. Or there's been a car accident or cancer. I mean, there's every age of life is something that we deal with. And so for me, I've done funerals for 26-week gestation. right through to 104 is my eldest person that I've had the privilege to bury, and then everything in between. So, lots to share today about this amazing topic.
When you're a minister of the gospel, there's this old saying, I've used this a few times, ministers of the gospel, there to hatch 'em, match 'em, and dispatch 'em.
Correct.
And when you are a minister of the gospel, as you've been for such a long time, 1,300 funerals, sad stories, every one of them is a sad story. Not every one of those that you have buried have been Christian believers. Some of them have come from probably, atheistic backgrounds, and they drag themselves to the funeral. Everyone's wearing black. Everyone looks as sad as they can look because that's the way that's reflected in their heart. And then there are those Christian funerals. And, you might have had the privilege of going to a Christian funeral where it has been such an uplifting experience. If we're getting into the nitty-gritty here, Steve, when you talk about the difference between a funeral that is coloured by faith in Christ and a funeral that has no faith and no understanding of God and of eternity, what do you reflect on?
Yeah, the first reflection is it's tough because we live in such hope. We do not grieve at those without hope. And so when we go into a believer's service, while there is great sadness, we would do anything we could to have our loved ones still with us, there is that hope of eternity, and there's hope of reconnection, and there's all those wonderful imageries that, Revelation brings us and the Bible brings us of no more tears, and so there's great hope attached. When you take away that hope, it's really hard to, I find it hard to pretend. And so I guess we lean on things like stories and what they brought to community. And let's be real here, whether you're a believer or not a believer, you can still be an outstanding member of society. You can be a brilliant dad, mum, son, daughter. All those things are still very true. But it's that challenge of not being able to speak about the hope of eternity that takes away, the mourning into joy, that switch. And so as someone officiating those services, then we, I guess, handle that by not going to places that are untrue. And we do lean on, hopefully, a great life lived. But even in saying that, I've done services for people that didn't live a great life. They were terrible people. They really were horrible. And yet you still have to do those services. I've done services where there's myself, the funeral director, and the gravedigger, and not one person turned up. And I'll still conduct a service to the best of my ability to honour the deceased. And it's an interesting thing because I know certainly when I was a younger Christian, I've been an ordained minister now for 30 years, but I probably had a bit of a disregard for the deceased in that, well, what's the issue? The person's in heaven. Like, what's it matter? But it really matters, Neil, the way we handle the deceased, the care that we show, the respect that we show for this amazing temple that carried this amazing person that we so deeply loved and God died for. And so I learned that as I went along, that the greater respect we carry and the honouring of the deceased is so important. And whether you're a believer or a non-believer, whether you're of one of the squillion other faiths outside of Christian, every person is precious in the sight of Christ and deserves our utmost honour. And so that was something that I learned as I went through those many hundreds of services and continue to do, is that no matter who they are, what they look like, what their background is, they receive, and I think we must give always the utmost respect.
Steve, you mentioned the word eternity, and sometimes that rolls off the tongue very easily for the believer who's aware of a Christian gospel and a time when you'll stand before God, a time when you'll go to heaven, a time when, even as the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 4, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. How much do you think that expectation of an eternity makes a difference to The person, well, all of us, really, might not be close to dying. How much does it make a difference to us having an understanding that there is an eternity, that there is a biblical heaven that awaits, instead of this idea that you go into nothingness, that everything stops on that moment that your heart beats its last beat? What are your thoughts here about eternity?
I think it's a complete game changer. It changes everything for people. Because, again, it's that word hope, isn't it? That expectation that we can look forward. You know that that God has prepared for us, that our eternity is secure, that the Father's house has many rooms, as John 14 says, that there's a place there that just brings that. Wow, the fact is we won't be here forever. I could be gone in the next minute, and it's all over. And yet, while there's great sadness to that, there's also great hope for my family that says, well, Steve has such a faith, and Christ was everything to him, and his eternity is in heaven. And people will, and even Christian people, they'll downgrade what eternity might be, and they'll justify it, and maybe it's just a lack of this, and is it really a place? And I don't want to get caught up in the theology. There are greater theologians than me that will argue both sides of this ledger. For me, when I am with a family and they say, we know that Dad is with the Lord, there's something about that conversation that is different to, how could God take my dad? Very different response.
Yeah.
Very different response. And I always battle with this, I hate God. He took this person from me. Well, hang on a minute. Your son died of a drug overdose. I'm not sure God took him from you. And so instead of hope and eternity and the comfort and peace of the Holy Spirit in that situation, you get the anger and the bitterness and the pointing and the accusation. And the two are so incredibly different, Neil, so different. I also want to put a counter, and I know you've got more questions, but I think for balance, I have certainly been to Christian services that have lacked what I would have expected, even in the hope and the joy of eternity. And again, we can't remove personality and character and makeup from how people respond. And so, the title or the life of Christian, we know is not a force field around our life, that nothing bad happens. In fact, the Bible is clear that the same rain falls on the believer and the non-believer. And so, yes, most Christian services that I get to conduct and attend are incredibly celebrational, why also incredibly sad. But it's not always the case.
We often talk about the assurance we have as believers that one day we will stand before God. It will be in eternity. It will be in heaven. But making that assurance real to the individual, how do we connect this with the Christian gospel, the good news that we might share with our friends, our own testimony, the good news about Christ? How do you think that all connects in there when the gospel becomes very powerful about an assurance of our future?
Yeah, what a great question. I would start with make sure it's good news. And I say that in that, often we can present God as nasty and mean and ready with a bat to belt us when we do anything wrong and we look the wrong way or say the wrong thing, or, I start with it's good news. He's a good God, a loving God, all caring God, all for us God, all forgiving God. And we can run into his arms, Neil, like we can run flat chat into his arms, even on our worst day. And yet so often, and I see it on social media all the time, even today I read a social media on a great post, and this absolute, let's not define them, but someone just destroyed the post by this idiotic, uneducated rant about how they saw God. And I tell you what, I'm glad. I hope I don't serve the same God as them, because mine doesn't relate to that at all. And so my first point is, let's make sure it's the good gospel, a God who cares and love. Jesus wept for his friend. The shortest verse in the Bible. There's kindness and compassion. I think that we need to present that you can have assurance of eternity, not because of who you are, not because of anything you've done. You cannot earn salvation. You can't buy salvation. You can only accept the free gift from God. And when we present this in a way that is a signpost to the goodness of God, then I think people can grab a hold of that. But I think sometimes we're our worst enemy. We're more concerned, and I don't want to get caught up in the theology, but we often get more concerned or major more on the minors instead of majoring on the majors, that God loves us, that Christ died for us, that we can accept his free gift, that we can know his peace and love and joy and kindness on earth, and we can have hope for an eternity with him. But there is a responsibility on us to present the good news of the gospel. And so it's not uncommon to have to untangle some of these messes when I'm in the middle of a family who are in deep grief.
This is 2020 with Neil Johnson, helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
Talk about a conversation that affects every single one of us. We're talking about death and dying. We're talking about a biblical Christian view of how all that works. We're asking, oh death, where is your sting? And starting to understand some of those issues around that. Now, our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You might like to join in our conversation, and we'll try and take as many calls as we can today. Let's first of all hear from Bartholomew, who's in Cairns in North Queensland. Hey, Bartholomew, welcome along.
Hello, how are you? Thank you for letting me join.
What are your thoughts for our guest?
It was a bit of a simple question, but I wanted to know that with his loved ones, does he do their services at the funeral as well, or does he get someone else to do that for him and his family?
Good thought here, Steve. Sometimes you want to be the person who's in the congregation and you want to be among the grieving rather than being the one who's up front. What do you do in your family situations?
Yeah, great question, Bartholomew. Thank you. My dad passed away, it must be about 6 years ago. Well, actually, March will be 7. And my dad asked me if I would do his service. And my mum always said, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. Please don't feel any pressure. But I did lead my dad's service, and I felt so privileged to do it. It was hard for sure, and I probably used notes more than I normally would in some ways because I wanted to get it right, and I knew if I went off on tangents too much, I'd get pretty emotional. But it was a real honour to do that, to be able to speak about my dad, to lead the service. My eldest brother did the eulogy. We did all the things that you would normally do. But yeah, I was the official. I officiated that service, and I'm really glad that I did that. I think if it was my kids or my wife, I probably couldn't. I would get someone else to do that. A minister friend of mine. But I just was really privileged to do that for my dad. So I think for my mum, dad, I probably would be okay, sister. But my immediate family, I think it would just be too hard. And as Neil said, sometimes you just want to sit in the seat and be part of being ministered to, apart from being on the stage. So, yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks, Bartholomew.
Anything further to add there, Bartholomew?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your call. Hey, our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You can join in our conversation, a conversation on a topic that affects every single one of us. Let's take another call. Someone who wants to remain anonymous from Perth in Western Australia. Hey, welcome along.
Thank you for the session this morning. I found out about the death of someone when I was in primary school, and that was over 60 years ago. I've had relatives in my own family who've died and been able to grieve their passing, such as my parents, for example. But this particular death, which happened due to a car accident, haunted me for a very long time. Another car came through a red light and hit the lady's car that I'm speaking about, and she unfortunately died. Recently, I went for professional help, which I wrote a letter, where I was able to write a letter appreciating the lady that I knew and how wonderful she was, and a wonderful woman living down the street from where she lived. She was the mother of 4 young children, unfortunately. And I went to her grave with the letter that I wrote and spent a lot of time there reading it out to her there at the cemetery. And it was only through doing that and getting help that I was able to find closure.
Wonderful thoughts here. Steve, what are your first initial impressions for our listener?
Yeah, just a great strategy that you were able to pick up, a great tool to use. Getting our stuff out and even down on paper, I think is really powerful. And then taking the time to go and speak to the person. And we know the person's not there, yet that's representative of them and their life is that graveyard, that grave site. So I think that was really, really a special moment for you, and well done for doing that. I'm so pleased to hear that helped you. We often, Neil, we take that further. Sometimes people do role plays. I know a minister that we used to do some training together, and after his dad died years later, he did a role play with somebody else, and the other person played the role of his dad, and he spoke to this person as if he was his dad, and he had some upset, he had some unfinished business, he had some pain, and it became incredibly healing for him to be able to do that. So there are lots of strategies within the grief counselling world that can be used, but I'm so glad this listener in Perth was just able to put those two things together. Firstly, to write down his thoughts and everything about that, and then secondly, to go and share that to what was representative of this person. So what a great thing. Thanks for sharing that with us today.
Just while we have you there in Perth, when you do that, there's something therapeutic, cathartic about writing down your feelings and having that note ready to read to the person. They've already departed this world. But that was, as you said, a thing that brought closure for you. And sometimes that closure is so important. It can take longer for some people than others. Was that the moment when you recognised that some of the pain was lifted off you? Can you reflect on that for us?
Yes, very much so. Actually, there was a good side to it in the long run, because that was the first time I realised that how close death was to us. And that was the first time I thought about God. And 10 years after that, I gave my life to the Lord.
Wow. That's awesome.
Okay, so that process was what led you to think about God. And then no doubt there were some friends or connections there that brought you into a relationship with him. Is that the way it worked for you?
Yes, that's right. I realised how close death can be to anyone. So it helped me to realise, is there something greater than all of this that we experience in this world? And that set my thoughts towards something greater, who is God.
Wonderful, wonderful insights. And thank you so much for having the courage today to pick up the call and just being so open with us. I appreciate you there in Perth. And thank you very much. We'll take some more calls very shortly. And 1-800-316-316 if you'd like to join into our conversation. This thought of doing things that might seem a little odd, as you say, Steve. You know that the person is not in the grave. Spirit's gone to be wherever God is going to put them. But speaking to the person, having the letter to write, getting those things off your chest, that's a powerful way to overcome these feelings of grief and bereavement.
Yeah, 100%. And it's the association, isn't it? We associate place. It's like, people say that, such and such died a year ago, and I was walking through the supermarket and their favourite song came on and they burst into tears in the middle of the supermarket. And it's that association. We associate things, places, smells, with the deceased person. And that can be really powerful in the positive, but it can be really powerful in the negative as well. And what our listener did is he used that from a positive perspective, got the things written down, and then went to what we now say is the person's resting place, so the body's resting place, and used that as a very, very powerful space for him to do what he needed to do, which, brought that really significant moment for him. I think it's great. Too often we limit what we can do. Be creative. There's so many opportunities out there to experience those that we love that are no longer with us, and that creativity is just fabulous.
Steve, this idea of being alive and that in itself being a terminal condition, we're encouraged in Scripture that this is the case. What are your thoughts here? Does this follow you around? Is this in your thoughts constantly? Do most people try to avoid the thoughts that life is a terminal condition? How do you sort of unpack things around that?
Yeah, I think they do. I think people, I read long time ago, and I've often used it when I've preached. We have clocks that go around and around in circles. And it gives this idea that time will just never end. But when you think about the old hourglass with the sand, it's really evident that the sand is going to run out. And often we just think for some reason it's just going to always keep going round and around and around. And we know that is actually not true. Life changes in moments, for the good and for the bad. It happens in moments. And you can have a phone call, a doctor's appointment, you can have a phone call from the police, you can be diagnosed, all sorts of things can happen that changes your world in a matter of seconds. I think for me, I have a very, very real and strong awareness that life can end at any second. And so we need to live life full, live with fullness and with passion, conviction, live, with joy, be a great person, make a difference, because at some point, and we don't know when that point is, eternity is on the radar. So there you go.
Let's take some calls. 1800 316 316 if you'd like to join in our conversation. Katerina is in Adelaide in South Australia. Hey, Katerina, welcome along.
Hi, thanks for the topic as well.
What are
I
your
was
thoughts?
just wondering, so, as Christians, we know that there's heaven and hell. And we know that, you got to have faith in Christ to be saved. What do you say when people that are atheists have always, or not necessarily even atheists, they could be any other religion, they could be even just people who say, I don't believe in Christ, I don't believe in God, blah, blah, blah. But then their family, when they die, they say, oh, so-and-so's gone on to a better place, or so-and-so's in heaven. And you're like, I'll just shut up and I won't say anything. But, you feel like going, I don't want to upset you more at a time of distress. But, they're not. And, you can choose, you can make a different choice. But, a lot of people even, even like my mum might go, oh, well, I'd rather... I'll be with my father and I'll be with my family, but would they want you in hell with them? Yeah. Do you know what I'm saying?
Katerina, yes, there's all sort of idealistic ideas people have about death and dying and what goes beyond. As you're hearing Katerina's heart here, Steve, what are your thoughts?
Yes. Thanks, Katerina. Firstly, thank you for being wise enough to not say anything when people are in distress, and just letting it go. It's really interesting. I think as time has gone on for me, and, I've probably moved significantly in some of my theologies. I've been a Pentecostal preacher for a long, long time, but I've moved in some areas. I probably don't accept the black and whites as much. I'm probably more comfortable in some grey. And what I mean by that is I think the goodness of God goes beyond what we can work out. And so, I don't know if you've ever been in a car crash or not, but, everything slows down. 1 second seems to go for an hour. I don't know what people do in that period of time. I don't know what people do in their heart.
Yeah.
Often people say things that they don't actually believe. And so I've come to the place, and I've had to use it a lot, where I say to people, look, if I had to, and I would be very cautious where I use this, but I might use a line, something along the lines of, look, I don't know where Grandma is. We don't know whatever, but I do know that I can be sure of my eternity and your eternity, depending on decisions. But I think God's goodness goes further than often we allow. Scripture says if we don't say something, the rocks will cry out. God goes so far to meet people. And then, of course, there's people with disabilities and there's people with inability to understand and all those things. Is God cruel enough to damn them to hell because they didn't have the capacity to understand? I don't believe God's like that. And so I'm very, very slow to never to make judgment in this space. I agree with you. People say all sorts of things that I think, oh, my goodness, it's so crazy and out there. But I just try to stick to kindness and to bring hope where I can. I don't know if that answers it, but I just love the fact that you were gracious and wise enough to go, I don't say anything. They're in pain already. You're right. They are. They're in complete pain, and they need you to be the hands and feet of Christ, not the judgment of Christ. So love them, serve them, help them, be there for them.
Katerina, any further thoughts from you?
No, that's kind of what I was thinking, but I also, part of me thinks that, if they, as you said, if there's those people in their mind, they might have come to Christ, and we don't know because we can't know, and it's between them and God in the end anyway. But you kind of also think you don't want people who are left here to look at that person's life and think, oh, well, that person doesn't believe in Christ and they're still going to go to heaven. When the people that are left here, they've got an opportunity to make, you know what I mean? Yeah. To say, to let Christ save their souls. But anyway.
Yeah, 100%. It's to have the wisdom to know when to bring it up, the wisdom to know when to talk it more.
Yeah, obviously not at funerals. I don't.
To share, as we said earlier, Neil and I spoke about the good news and the importance of sharing it as good news, being good news, the gospel. And so, but we appreciate what you're saying there. And I think everybody has that struggle of, those who we know or we think are non-believers, and how do we handle that? The bottom line is it's a tough situation. It is a tough situation. Kindness is the best option.
Katerina, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Just before we take the next call, this thought: I don't know where your loved one is, but I do know that they are in the hands of a loving and faithful and just God. And at that point, we release them in that sense. But that becomes a motivation to us too, if we have some idea of just how valuable and how precious this gospel is to our own hearts. Steve, have you got any thoughts here about what the death of a loved one or of someone that we know actually has as an effect on our own spirituality, on our own commitment to serve Christ and to move in his mission?
Great question, Neil. And I note that you phrase that from the positive, and I agree with that. But often it's a negative. In fact, often what we see when there's a death is there's a crisis of faith. And people will say, I prayed and fasted for the healing of my mum. Our whole church prayed for my 9-year-old daughter to be healed from cancer. And what happens is it's not only isn't it a motivator, it's a demotivator. It's a crisis of faith. How could a loving God allow my loved one to die? He must be mean. Or how does a loving God not save my 9-year-old daughter? He mustn't be all-powerful. Because they're the two things that we talk about. And neither of those came true in this scenario. And so it's so incredibly difficult. And it comes back, I think, to, we love equations. We want to know that if we do A and B, we will get C. So if I pray 3 times a day and I fast 1 day a week, and I speak to my pastor and I tithe and I stand on my head and I swing from a tree, if I do all those things in the right order, then God will have to do what I'm asking. And so we have a crisis of faith when pain and suffering and death come, uninvited into our worlds. And so the opposite to that, though, is exactly what you said, Neil. For many, it inspires people to be more evangelistic. It inspires people to live more and better and more helpful and kinder and service to the world. And so you get both sides of this ledger when people die. And so, yeah, it's a very complicated area.
1-800-316-316. To join in our conversation, let's take another call. Sue is in Kingston in Tasmania. Hey, Sue, welcome along.
Hello, Neil. Thank you, and thank you to your guest. I came on very belatedly just before the news, but it's prompted me to share because I had a very long and complex relationship with my father. And when I was 41, I became a born-again Christian, and I was able to learn to forgive him and love him and respect him as my father, even though his bad behaviour continued for many years afterwards. But what happened at the time he was dying, he had... it's a very complex situation, which I won't go into, other than the fact that I had come to realise through my Christian walk with my journey with Jesus, how important forgiveness was. And so when he was in hospital for 3 months before he died, he didn't want to see me, and I wrote him a beautiful letter, sent him a beautiful card to say that I had truly forgiven him and loved him and wished him all the very, very best. My thoughts and prayers were with him. And then when the night he died, I spoke to the staff member who was looking after him. I'd actually got the local priest to go and be with him a fortnight before he passed away. So the priest had established a relationship with him. And the night he died, I asked the staff member looking after him if he would tell my father that I loved him, that I was with him in thoughts and prayers. And later I was told that he died very peacefully. Well, my mother had denied any sort of public viewing of Dad's body. I hadn't seen him for 3 months, as I said. And at the funeral, which was a beautiful celebration of his life, I was talking to one of the undertakers, and I said my only regret was that I hadn't been able to see my father before he died, or see him after he had died. And the funeral undertaker said, well, it's not too late. We can organise for you to do that. So they arranged for me to go in and sit beside my father with his open coffin. They gave me a note paper and pen to write a note and place in his pocket, his shirt pocket. He looked beautiful and so at peace. And that helped to bring massive healing into my life. So I thank God for that undertaker.
Wonderful stuff, Sue. Let's get a thought or two from our guest, Steve Morrison. As you're hearing Sue's story, is this something, I guess, this is not the first time you've heard a story similar to that, but what are your thoughts here for Sue?
Well, what we're raising there is the issue of viewing, actually. And a lot of people are very afraid of viewing. I'm a big fan of viewing for most people. And I just want to say up front that kids handle viewing better than adults on 99% of the time. In fact, I often see family members out in the other room, and the deceased person will be in a side room, and it'll be the 6-year-old, granddaughter who'll be going out and saying, do you want to come and see Poppy? Why don't you come in and see Granddad? Come and say goodbye to Granddad. They just do it better, because often people are like, oh, I'll never let my kid come. And years ago, we would remember in our age, Neil, that kids weren't even allowed to really go to funerals. And it wasn't probably till the last 10, 15 years that it became a thing for everybody, which I'm really pleased. Viewings are very powerful. Things can be said, things can be asked, things can be told. If it's not suitable, the undertaker will say, no, there can't be a viewing, and that can be for all sorts of reasons. But I think what we heard from Sue is that, again, there was that cathartic response of being able to do what she needed and wanted to do and say to her father. So, yeah, that's a great story. Thank you, Sue, so much.
And while we've got Sue, sometimes when the death is sudden, those sorts of reconciliation conversations you might have and the forgiveness, we'd like for those to happen before our loved one passes, but as Sue's demonstrated, you can do this after as well. But have you got any reflection here, Steve, on actually making those relationships right while you can, while there is a living loved one that you can actually talk to, rather than leaving it until after?
Oh, 100%. If you can, do it. What if you just made the decision today that no matter who was at fault, you're going to do everything you can to bring peace? And maybe you are the victim, but if it's on your heart and if you believe it's right, maybe get some advice, get some counselling around it, get some support. But I just think we need to continually remember that the sand in the hourglass is running out very quickly. And if we can make things right before death, then that is by far the best option. And I just say it again, you may need to get good support and some tools in able to do that, depending on the situation. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you step back into danger or you step into an abuse or any of those things. But forgiveness is not about the other person, actually. It's about you and about you living your best life. So I'd encourage you, before there's a passing, if you can, go and deal with some of those important things.
Sue in Kingston in Tasmania, thank you so much for your call. Let's take one more call and then we'll sort of bring some loose ends together and some words of encouragement. But Paul is in Mackay in Queensland. Hey, Paul, welcome.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks, fellas.
What are your thoughts?
Listening to this conversation and many others along the line, everyone seems to blame God when, we say our prayers, do whatever we think's going to do to cure the dying. In reality, this is Satan, that operation in the world. It was through the original sin that death ended. If we go back to creation, we were created to live forever with happy, healthy lives. And then sin entered the earth and so did death. And, I don't think we're sort of, this isn't God letting us down. This is Satan taking it away.
Interesting perspectives on all of that. Steve, your thoughts for Paul?
Well, he's correct. The creation, absolutely, we're meant to live forever. That was God's plan. And death entered the world when sin entered the world, and we know the creation story, and we are living the outcome of that now forever and a day. And so, yeah, I agree. I don't blame God for stuff. I thank God for getting me through the stuff. And it's a different response, isn't it, that just says, death's going to come, things are going to go wrong. We live in a fallen world. We live in an evil world. Often, the enemy prowls around like a lion looking who he can devour. There's so much going on. And so I take that stance always, Neil, of how can I serve humanity best? How can I be the best to other people, knowing that we absolutely live in a fallen world and we do have to deal with sickness and evil and death as part of life. And that's the reality of the world that we live in.
Paul in
Thanks,
Mackay,
Paul.
Thank you so much for your call. Let's put a line under any calls here and just come back to some of these things where we might appreciate the power of the gospel and the thought that, death, where is your sting? And I always love those words that Jesus used at the death of his good friend Lazarus. When he said to Lazarus' sister, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. We've got these promises, these assurances, the things that Jesus said coming to pass, and even as that was in the lead up to his own crucifixion and his resurrection. And he would have been referring to the fact that if I'm saying that I'm the resurrection and the life, I'm going to demonstrate that to you in just a few days from now. When you reflect on these sorts of images we have of Jesus, on the words that he said to encourage us, Steve, what do we take away from those that might be an empowerment for us in our lives today?
Well, where we began, Neil, that there is great hope for the believer in life and in death. And if there's a first day, there will be a last day. So live your life in all of its fullness. Be the best you can possibly be. All the things that we know we should be doing, do them. Do them knowing that the last day will come. Love better, forgive quicker, take the adventure, serve, help, do the things that we can do, because we know that in Jesus' words, we know death will come. We know about it. So because we know about it, I think we should take some responsibilities. If you've never sat down and told your family members whether you want to be buried or cremated, I ask every person listening to this podcast and radio today to make that your dinner table conversation tonight. Hey, I was listening to this crazy guy on radio today, and he said that we should ask everybody around the table, do you want to be buried or cremated? The amount of pain I walk through with families because they can't decide on that and they argue over it depending on who's in the room, it's not necessary. Just ask every family member, what would you like to do? And if you can, ask them a few other questions. Would you like this? Would you like that? What's your thing? What about your power of attorneys? Do you have a will? The amount of pain that's caused by people who don't have wills and that they lose things. You've got to have something, even if it's scribbled down on a piece of paper and you sign it. Please make sure you have a will. Here's 3 H's that I talk about with grief, Neil, very quickly. The first one is hang around. Just be with people. Don't be in the way, but be with people. Don't be afraid to be there. The second is hug. If you're a hugger and they're a hugger, good, give them a hug. But I probably mean step into someone else's pain. Don't be afraid of their pain. Don't be afraid of the tears. Step into their world. And the third one is hush. Whatever you say is not going to help anyway. So just be quiet. Don't tell your stories, when my dad did this, when that. Just hang around, hug and hush. Be there, be okay with their pain, and just be quiet and love on them. And I reckon that'll go a long way to supporting those that we love.
Hang around, hug and hush. And hugs to you, I guess, from lots of listeners today, Steve. A wonderful contribution to the way we think about dying. And for all of us, we're all going to die unless there's a rapture that comes first, and there's a special hope in that a lot of believers have. But we're either going to die of natural causes, or it might even be some tragedy that takes us away from loved ones. And what great insight, what great advice to prepare our own lives and to be prepared for how we take those next steps and with our family, those ones that we love. Now, to connect with Steve, you can do. Steve is a thanatologist. So, want to talk about issues around dying and death. Steve's your man. He's a transformational life coach too. You can hear the wisdom as it just oozes out. He's a chaplain. He's a specialist counsellor. You can connect with him on social media. So look for Steve Morrison on Facebook or Instagram. You can connect with Steve on LinkedIn. You can email Steve too. You might even have a special question. Something's triggered something in you and you think, I might just flick an email off to Steve. Steve@ohmygrief.com. ohmygrief.com. Steve, I hope we get you back again on another day very soon, because there's so much more to talk about. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much for taking some time to share your heart and your expertise with our listeners today on 2020.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's been a pleasure. I'd love to come back.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.